Now, one of the most absurd things about this case is that there is a real possibility that the real murderer, Jeffrey Gaffor, will get a lower tariff than the ones who did not commit that crime and demonstrably are innocent. Where is the human rights and justice in that? Now, I'd like to talk about another case that illustrates issues of human rights, and that is a case of a man named Neil Sayers, and it illustrates the same point about whether lawyers are performing to the best of their abilities. What happened in that particular case is a young man named Russell Crooks was horribly murdered, and his body was found some 12 to 13 days after he was killed. Another person confessed to this murder, but this confession was really an accusation against Neil Sayers. There were a number of scientific, forensic science techniques that could have been used to prove whether this confession was true or not. And in actual fact, it is demonstrably false on a number of issues. But the man's lawyers did not bother to instruct experts. They didn't go looking for forensic science to test this confession. And this happens on a daily basis. There are cases going on throughout the country now where people could potentially prove innocence. And by proving innocence, it means somebody else is responsible, and that the police and the system has a duty to protect us and protect our human rights by allowing us to live in a society that doesn't leave us open to crimes like this and to real criminals. And instead of protecting such people, they should be going out to use these techniques to find out who really committed these crimes. Now, in the Sayers case, he is now left in prison without possibility of an appeal at this particular moment, because the system assumes that lawyers then advise on the possibility of whether they should be allowed to appeal. Well, short of his lawyers saying, the reason Mr. Sayers was convicted was because I'm an utter incompetent, there isn't much option. He now is in the position where a number of techniques could have helped to prove his innocence, each one of which was technically available at the time of this crime, and was available to his defence if they had thought it worthwhile to do. The fact that they didn't means that he will not get what the courts call a second bite of the cherry. But the fact of this particular case is he didn't have a first bite. Now, the protection of his human rights also means the protection of the human rights of the rest of us. And it is very likely that his co-accused committed this crime and did so on his own, and has framed another person for that in the form of Mr. Sayers. There are a number of other cases where this type of thing occurs. Why is it that we find it acceptable that lawyers can basically be assumed to have practiced to the best of their abilities, when in actual fact they haven't? I am not a trained lawyer, nor am I a trained scientist, but I noticed from reading the pathologist's report that maggots have been taken from the body. And I started asking, well, what's been done with these maggots? There is a science called forensic entomology. What did they do with them? And they couldn't answer me. The lawyers that succeeded, the original lawyers, that didn't even bother to ask the police what had happened to these maggots, because they were so convinced that the maggots would not exist anymore. Eventually, it turns out the maggots did exist and they could be examined, but they had been handled so badly that the evidence that they could have given was lost irredeemably, and the police actually got away with throwing away the fixed sample of maggots, the ones that would have told how long the body had been in the state that since the murder actually occurred. It's basically the life cycle of the insect can help you to establish when a crime took place. In this particular case, it can't be done. But the only person who pays the price for this not being able to be done is Neil Sayers, and it is the same for all victims of miscarriages of justice in this particular position. Forensic science is now leaps and bounds ahead of what was possible just 7 years ago when he was convicted. many new techniques have been discovered. DNA is now so sensitive and discriminating that it is possible to identify the perpetrator of a crime by having the DNA of a close relative. That's how the murder of Lynette White was solved. The murderer's nephew was on the National DNA database, and one allele, which is one of the banned positions, you have 20 in your DNA chain, in the DNA that is actually tested. One of them was so rare, it eliminated 99% on its own. By expanding the search from first to 8 and then 12 alleles, they were able, and concentrating in the geographic area of South Wales, they were able to identify the one person who would, the boy who possessed this DNA was the nephew of the real murderer. And eventually they managed to get the real murderer to give a DNA sample. That is how they found him. But the methods used to do that are only available to the police. They are able to check the National DNA database on any crime where DNA is at issue. The defence cannot do so. They're not entitled to even ask the custodians of the National DNA database, do you have a match or a potential match to a relative of the perpetrator in the case that I'm sort of dealing with? Where is the justice in that? In the Sayers case, following the Byford report in 1995, the National Crime and Operations Faculty was established. This was to ensure that investigative opportunities were not missed. This meant that advances in forensic science were available to police forces simply by asking if they can is there any technique that would assist? While the police quite rightly have access to such resources, defence lawyers do not. Why do we assume that defence lawyers are going to be competent in forensic science? After all, if they were competent in forensic science, they would be forensic scientists. They should have the right to consult a resource such as the National Crime and Operations Faculty. And if they had, we would have a fairer system. We're not saying people should simply be entitled to find any loophole that they can in order to avoid the consequences of crimes that they have committed. But the innocent deserve every opportunity to prove their innocence. And if they haven't been afforded that during the trial process, then the appeal process must make up for that, and it must give them the chance to do so. And if that doesn't work, there should be a body that allows them to consult and have access to the most sophisticated scientific techniques that are currently available. Now, going back to the Lynette White inquiry, the situation now is that 28 people, including 15 police officers, have been arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice and perjury. It is the first time in British history that an inquiry has extended to this level. The police now are going to have to account for what happened in this. But that raises other questions. What about the performance of the Forensic Science Service that allowed an implausible hypothesis to be given as evidence in order to explain inconvenient evidence? The evidence the forensic science should have presented was, it should have been able to say, this is simply not possible. You cannot have committed this crime without leaving some trace of yourself in that room and to the victim, and have some trace of that crime on yourself. It is not physically possible for that to have happened. But instead of that, it said that a witness, a female witness, happened to have the same combination of rare blood groups as the real murderer. So they claimed that a small quantity of her blood, a quantity of her blood mixed in with a small quantity of the blood of one of the alleged killers to create the impression of male blood. What this scientist failed to tell the jury was that this very technique, because it was so sensitive, it could not eliminate a single male on the face of the earth. But then you can also look at it from the other point of view. What if you had a combination of male blood with this combination of rare blood groups, and a small quantity of female blood, then you can't eliminate any woman either. So the only forensic science evidence in this particular case could not eliminate a single person on the face of the earth, including that scientist. The jury were never told this. The jury were told they had witnesses who contradicted themselves, each other, and indisputable forensic evidence left, right and centre, to the point that the judge actually said, if these witnesses are telling the truth and that these 5 men were in the room, there had to have been a 6th man. And this 6th man was not only was he not named by any of these witnesses, they never even acknowledged his existence. Now, the Crown Prosecution Service are charged with ensuring independence of prosecuting decisions from the police. They had at the time a criteria for the code for Crown prosecutors. It set out evidential criteria. There were 13 of them at the time. 10 of them said that they should have exercised great caution as to whether this prosecution should have gone ahead. Instead of that, the prosecution goes ahead. The other 3 simply did not apply. Where was the competence of and professionalism of the Crown Prosecution Service in this case? And the same applies to the Forensic Science Service. It is not simply a case of South Wales Police doing a particularly shoddy job in this particular case and allowing a miscarriage of justice to happen. The whole of the criminal justice system combined to allow an outrageous miscarriage of justice to happen. And it is only now being acknowledged because they were forced, kicking and screaming, into using the new techniques into trying to find the real murderer. Now, are we going to force anybody claiming to be innocent that they have to go down the same route, that in order to prove that they are innocent, they are going to have to say, you have to believe my innocence now, because this is the real murderer? If they are, we might as well disband the police force, because we're effectively going to say that victims of miscarriages of justice are the new police force. It's going to be their job to find the perpetrators of miscarriages of justice. And in the meantime, what about the human rights of the public who are going to be left at risk, but thinking that they have been protected? What about the human rights of the families of the victims of these crimes, and also the families of the victims of the miscarriages of justice? One thing you will hear from John and Paddy later, I would presume, is the difficulties faced by the victims of miscarriages of justice, and how the families of the victims are just thrown out of the Court of Appeal and expected to get on with their lives. All too often, they end up being forced back into the arms of a family who have no idea how to care for them, because they don't know these people anymore. They have changed irrevocably in some cases because of the experiences and the outright abuse of human rights that have happened to them by the illegal stealing of their liberty. These people are now being put in the position where they are unpaid carers for the victims of these miscarriages of justice. They have to put up with the difficulties that these people face, and they have to provide care for them because there is nothing there. To give an example now, following the case of a man called Johnny Kamara, the government initiated a project called the Miscarriages of Justice Project to provide aftercare for victims of miscarriages of justice. It only applied to those who had been referred back to the Court of Appeal by the Criminal Cases Review Commission or its predecessor, the Home Secretary. This essentially meant that any person who won their appeal on the first time wasn't being considered as a miscarriage of justice victim in need of aftercare, because the government was saying the system is functioning correctly if it has corrected a miscarriage of justice at the first attempt.